This video is made possible by NordVPN. Start protecting your internet experience today at nordvpn.org/geographics and use code geographics to get 70% off, only $3.49 a month, plus an additional month for free. And let's get into it. Deep in the Austrian Alps, a mere 90 or so kilometers from Munich, sits a small, anonymous castle. From the outside, Schloss Itter isn't much to look at. In a land filled with medieval ruins, it's too small to attract passing tourists, too similar to 1,000 forts you can find elsewhere. But Itter has something that no other castle in Austria, or indeed the world, can claim. A story. A story about a single skirmish that became one of the strangest battles in history. It was here in 1945 that America and Germany fought as allies for the only time in World War II. A prison for French VIPs, Castle Itter in May of 1945 was at the mercy of SS units prowling the Austrian countryside. Desperate to prevent a massacre, a ragtag team of American GIs and disillusioned Wehrmacht soldiers teamed up to save those who were trapped inside the castle. But the story of Castle Itter is more than just that of a single battle. It's about a specific place, a specific moment in time, and the decisions that were made there, they would change European history. Like so many historic buildings in Europe, the precise origins of Castle Itter, or Schloss Itter to give it its German name, have been lost to history. We know a fortress existed on this secluded spot in the 13th century, but it's been suggested that that one may have been there since at least 800 AD. What is certainly true is that by 1878, Itter was old enough to have gone utterly out of fashion, and it was rebuilt in its current faux romantic style. For the modern Castle Itter, existing meant simply sitting back and watching as the world refused to take any notice of it. In the early 20th century, for example, it was converted into a luxury hotel, only to fail to attract visitors. It was simply too remote, too deep into the mountains for people to bother with it. However, there was one group of people who would be very taken with the castle's remoteness. In 1933, an unfunny Charlie Chaplin tribute act that went by the name of Adolf Hitler became the undisputed ruler of Germany. 5 years later, on March 12, 1938, the genocidal tramp annexed Austria into the Third Reich. As soon as the Nazis got their first good look at Itter, they knew they had to have it. The owners of the castle were served with one of those typical Nazi notices that basically said, "Yeah, look, we're gonna take your castle, don't let the door hit you on your way out." From that point on, Castle Itter would be under direct control of Hitler's regime. That's not to say anyone really knew what to do with it. At first, the castle housed the German Association for Combating the Dangers of Tobacco, which we wish we could say was a deliberately boring pseudonym for an exciting spy agency, but no, it was actually really just a bunch of dudes who hated tobacco. But by 1943, the Third Reich had finally found a purpose for their new castle. That year, Itter was converted into a subcamp of Dachau. Established all the way back in 1933, Dachau was the first and one of the most notorious of all Nazi concentration camps. Originally, it had been a small place designed to hold social democrats and other political prisoners. But as the Third Reich's list of enemies grew, Dachau had also grown, going from a single camp outside of Munich to a sprawling network of 123 subcamps covering most of southern Germany and northern Austria. As Dachau grew, so did its cruelty. Roma and LGBT prisoners had joined the Social Democrats, along with, of course, thousands of Jews. Nazi scientists had been conducting medical experiments on the prisoners. In short, becoming part of Dachau was not a happy fate for Castle Itter. However, the subcamp the Nazis established there, it was a bit of a different beast. It would not hold political enemies or those targeted for extermination, but rather VIPs, high-value prisoners the Nazis could use as hostages if the need ever arose. And the hostages the regime had earmarked for Itter were some of the most important people in Europe. When Sebastian Wimmer arrived at Itter in 1943, the SS officer must have felt like he was beginning the strangest assignment of all time. The commandant for the new Dachau subcamp, Wimmer had probably seen his fair share of crazy stuff during the war, but it's unlikely he'd ever had to oversee a group of prisoners quite like this. Interred in Castle Itter was a veritable who's who of French society. There was Edouard Daladier, the former French premier who'd signed the Munich Agreement before trying to flee into exile after the Nazis invaded. There was Paul Reynaud, who'd taken over as premier after Daladier and overseen the fall of France to the Germans. Alongside them were the generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, both famous but for very different reasons. While Gamelin had fought the Nazi invasion as head of the French armed forces, Weygand had replaced him, surrendered, and then collaborated with the regime before falling foul of it. To say the two generals hated each other is kind of like saying Cain and Abel had minor disagreements. With them were both Charles de Gaulle's sister, Marie Agnes, and Michel Clemenceau, son of the great Georges Clemenceau, and Hansley, the only prisoner fluent in German. At the slightly odder ends, the castle also held future Nobel Prize winner Léon Gehot, the champion tennis star Jean-Robert Barotra, and the infamous French fascist François de Larocque, who'd turned out to be too loco even for the Nazis. And yes, that's a lot of names to remember, but don't worry about memorizing them all. We'll try and remind you each time someone important crops up. By the standards of Dachau, these VIPs, they kind of had it okay. Remember how Castle Itter used to be a hotel? Well, the Nazis hadn't bothered stripping out too many of its comforts, especially as they wanted their hostages in good shape if they needed to trade them. The prisoners were allowed to use the castle library, walk the grounds relatively freely, and eat semi-decent food. They were even spared from brutality by Commandant Wimmer, who advised his guards to alternately ignore the prisoners and to befriend them. But still, a weekend in Hawaii, this was not. For one thing, the prisoners hated one another. Imagine being locked up inside a luxury castle alongside a bunch of people whose political views are diametrically opposed to yours. Imagine being locked up with people who consider you a traitor and aren't shy of telling that to your face. Before long, the VIPs had split into three tribes who refused to interact. The rightist, who'd supported Vichy France, the leftist, who'd been anti-Nazi for years, and the neutrals, who probably wondered what they'd done to deserve this. There was also a fourth group of prisoners. Being VIPs, the hostages clearly weren't going to help maintain Castle Itter, nor were the SS guards who had signed on to further the glory of the fatherland not act as servants to a bunch of bossy Frenchmen. So the Nazis decided to bring in Eastern European prisoners to the castle who could do all of the cooking, cleaning, and general upkeep that no one else wanted to do. Among their number was a Croatian communist who'd fought for Tito's partisans and was now slumming it as a prisoner of war. His name was Zvonimir Chuchkovitz, and he's one you're definitely going to want to remember. But just before we continue with today's video, I do want to take a moment to tell you about today's sponsor who make this video possible, and that's NordVPN. If you're buying things online and using a public Wi-Fi spot, think, coffee shops, airports, places like that, it's a good idea to use a VPN, and that's where NordVPN comes in. I know it's tempting not to bother and kind of hope for the best. I know I have done that in the past, but really those stories you read online about people having their data stolen, their identity hacked, things like that, they do happen, and I don't want it to happen to you. Whenever I'm browsing on public Wi-Fi, I just always have the VPN on in the background, whether I'm on my phone, iPad, laptop, whatever. But it's not all about security. You can also use it to change the country that you appear to be in, so you can get content that might normally only be available in specific geographic locations. And as a British man who does not live in Britain, I might say that I might use that. NordVPN is super fast, so watching videos is a breeze. There's no lag whatsoever. If you ever used VPNs and thought they were slow, well, no more with NordVPN. And you can use it on all of your devices very easily: Android, Chrome, Windows, and on 6 different devices at once with one account. And there are also no logs, unlike companies based in the EU or US. NordVPN, they're based in Panama, so they don't have to keep logs at all, which is great for your privacy. Indeed, they're the only VPN to get a perfect score from PCMag. Start protecting your internet experience today at nordvpn.org/geographics. Code geographics to get 70% off NordVPN, only $3.49 a month, plus an additional month for free. And let's get back to it. As World War II rumbled on, life in Castle Itter settled into a mind-numbing routine. Well, almost. As 1943 gave way to 1944, it became clear to the prisoners that things weren't going the way that Hitler might have hoped. Their food supplies were dwindling as rationing took its toll. Eventually, oil lamps and candles came to replace electricity. By 1945, even Commandant Wimmer must have seen the writing on the wall. At night, Allied aircraft were droning through the sky, raining death down onto countless German cities. It's entirely possible the inmates even saw the distant flickering glow of fires consuming the center of Munich during the 71 bombing raids that the city suffered. But rather than fill them with hope, all this evidence of Germany's downfall filled the prisoners with paralyzing dread. We know this because in April 1945, Michel Clemenceau, remember the German-speaking son of the legendary Georges Clemenceau, asked Commander Wimmer to a private meeting with himself, ex-premier Paul Renault, and General Gamelin. In the meeting, Clemenceau delicately reminded Wimmer that all their lives were in his hands. Wimmer, perhaps with one eye on a possible future war crimes tribunal, assured them that he had no desire to see them executed. If push came to shove, he would help them escape. It wouldn't be long before Wimmer's promise was put to the test. On April 29, 1945, the Allies liberated the Dachau main camp just 93 kilometers to the north. News reached Itter quickly, but unfortunately something else reached the castle just as quickly, and that was Eduard Itter. A former bookseller who'd made a career out of being a nobody, Itter had been handed the keys to Dachau at the end of September 1943 and told to get on with it. As someone who hadn't even joined the Nazi Party until 1937, there had been some hope that this lifelong bureaucrat would be a relatively humane commandant. While we've seen a couple of sources say that he was hands-off in his cruelty, we've seen others say that he mass-executed 2,000 prisoners just before Dachau's liberation. Either way, his arrival in Itter put everyone on edge. Was he here to execute the VIP prisoners as well? Well, actually no, as it turned out. Itter did indeed kill someone at Castle Itter, but not who the hostages expected. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in his bunker. When the news reached Itter on May 2nd, Eduard Itter took his pistol and shot himself through the heart. Gruesomely, the Dachau commandant survived the initial gunshot. Even more gruesomely, he then managed to raise the gun to his head and fire again. This time, the bullet did its job. In the wake of Itter's bloody suicide, something in Commandant Wimmer seems to have snapped. On the night of May 3rd, Wimmer and his men abandoned their posts, fleeing into the Austrian countryside. Wimmer's promise to Michel Clemenceau had apparently been forgotten. The next morning, the VIP hostages at Itter woke up to discover they were all alone. Not 20 kilometers west, the American army was rolling through Austria's mountains, grinding painfully onwards towards Vienna. To the north, Allied forces were securing the villages around Munich. Now all the VIPs had to do was stay alive long enough for someone to rescue them. Unfortunately, this was easier said than done. On the bright Austrian morning of May 4th, 1945, Major Joseph Gangl, better known as Sepp to his friends, was exhausted. Not 6 months before, Gangl had been a career military man in the German Wehrmacht army, following orders unquestioningly. By April that year, though, it found himself stationed in Austria, the Third Reich crumbling around him, completely disillusioned with Hitler's regime. Before the Führer even committed suicide, Gangl had contacted the Austrian resistance, offering his expertise. And now, here he was, followed by a mere 20 loyal Wehrmacht soldiers, trying to survive in an environment where wearing a German army uniform was extremely inadvisable. As Gangl moved his small company through the tiny picturesque town of Wörgl, he may well have been thinking that he simply couldn't wait for the war to end. If that was the case, then fate was about to throw Sepp Gangl a cruel curveball in the form of a wild-eyed Croatian on a bicycle. So remember Zvonimir Čukovic, the Croatian handyman at Castle Itter? We said you'd definitely want to remember. Well, when the VIPs had all woken up that morning to find Wimmer and the guards gone, they'd raided the castle armory, tooling up with pistols, rifles, and submachine guns. But even kitted out like the Expendables, the hostages had been afraid to leave Itter. In the chaotic last days of the war, rogue Gestapo and SS units had taken to roaming the countryside on a deranged mission to kill as many non-Nazis as possible. The forests around Itter were crawling with these werewolves who might decide to check in on the subcamp at any moment. So the VIPs had decided someone needed to go and get help. And that was how Čukovic came to be riding a bike through Wörgl just as Sepp Gangl stepped onto the square. Quite how the conversation between the two went has been lost to time. The upshot is that Čukovic managed to tell Gangl all about the trapped French VIPs. Tired as he was, the German army major agreed to help. Pointing Čukovic in the direction of Innsbruck, where the main American forces were, Gangl ordered his men to fashion a great white surrender flag. Then they all hopped in a truck pointed towards Itter and drove headlong into the Allied 23rd Tank Battalion. Had Gangel not thought to wave his flag, there's a very good chance this story would now include a scene where the tiny Wehrmacht force wound up on the receiving end of Uncle Sam's finest tank shells. Instead, Gangel got to meet face-to-face with the last major character in our tale today, and that's First Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr. A 27-year-old from New York State, Lee just happened to be around when his commanders heard Gangel's wild story and agreed to help. He immediately volunteered to take 2 tanks and 8 men and head to Itter on a rescue mission. And so it was that in late afternoon of May 4th, 1945, the only joint US Army Wehrmacht force fielded in the whole of World War II set off across Austria for the remote Castle Itter. Had they known what fate awaited them there, they might just have left the prisoners to fend for themselves. Despite the German surrender now being a mere 3 days away, the route to Castle Itter was anything but easy for Lee and Gangel's joint force. They lost time having to dismantle an SS booby trap and then wound up leaving one of their 2 tanks behind. Finally, just before they reached the castle, they ran into a group of SS setting up a roadblock. At the sight of the tank, the SS scattered into the woods. But by now, it was all too clear that they would soon be converging on Castle Itter. When Gangel, Lee, and their combined 28 troops came roaring into the castle grounds atop a tank, they probably felt like saviors. But the French VIPs inside, they weren't inclined to agree. At the sight of the ragtag group, they were less hooray and more like, guys, that's it. The problem was that there was no way to evacuate the hostages without more vehicles. So Gangel and Lee decided to settle in for the night and wait for reinforcements. Lee made his men park the tank at the gate, covering the only road up. It wasn't a bad plan. Everyone in the castle was armed, the walls were thick, and they had a tank. As the strange mix of American, French, and German settled in to wait till morning, they must have felt pretty safe. It was at this point that everything went assault on Precinct 13. At 11 p.m., the SS units on the hills surrounding Itter suddenly opened fire. Bullets pounded into the castle walls, chipping away the ancient stone. But in the darkness, all it did was make those trapped inside the castle hunker down and avoid the windows. All night long, the gunfire from the forests kept up, interrupted only by the occasional burst of return fire from the castle. But as dawn broke, the nature of the game suddenly changed. As the sun began to rise, an anti-tank missile streaked out of the forest, smashed into the Allied tank, and blew it to pieces. A second missile then slammed into the castle, destroying an entire room. But the worst came just moments later. Barely had the sound of the second explosion stopped ringing in their ears, then the Allies heard gunfire and watched in horror as over 100 battle-hardened SS soldiers began pouring out of the forest, determined to take the castle. It was the beginning of one of the final battles of World War II in Europe, and it certainly wouldn't be without bloodshed. As the 2 SS columns converged on the castle entrance and its lowest wall, those inside took to the rooftop, returning fire. For the first time in the entire war, German Wehrmacht troops en masse fired on Nazi SS units. Beside them, the VIP prisoners fought too. Clemenceau and ex-premier Renault both picked up weapons, as did tennis star Jean Barotta. Even the French fascist François de Larocque shot at the attackers with a rifle, surely one of the most surreal moments in a battle full of them. But while the Allies inflicted heavy casualties, the SS had the numbers, the weapons, and the ammunition on their side. Not long after fighting commenced, a sniper's bullet cut through Major Sepp Gangel. The Wehrmacht officer was dead before he hit the ground, finally able to rest after 6 long years. By noon, the course of the battle was turning. The tiny force inside it was overwhelmed and forced to retreat deep inside the castle keep. Luckily, though, help was on its way. We last saw Zvonimir Truchkowitz on May 4th cycling like a madman towards Innsbruck, where he hoped to meet the US Army. Well, Truchkowitz had rode clear to the 103rd Infantry Division, a near 60-kilometer ride. There, he had the fortune to bump into Major John T. Kramers. We say fortune because Kramers was the perfect man for the moment. See, Castle Itter was technically outside his jurisdiction. When he asked his superiors for permission to advance, they were like, no. To which Kramer effectively replied, actually, yes. I'm gonna go save some lives. However, this would be easier said than done. The road towards Itter was packed with refugees. At one point, Kramers and his men came under sustained artillery fire. By the time they reached Vogel on the morning of May the 5th, they didn't know if there was going to be anyone left at Castle Itter to save. Stood in the town, Kramers tried to raise Jack Lee on the radio, but he only got static back. Apparently, the major was at his wit's end until a local man suggested using a telephone. Incredibly, someone at the castle answered. Kramers told them that he was on his way. This was a good good job too, because by now those at the castle, they were out of ammo. As they retreated deep into the castle, prepared to fight with bayonets, the SS force was literally at the gates. The Nazi loyalists dragged their anti-tank gun down, aimed it at the wooden doors, and then looked up in horror as one of the Wehrmacht soldiers still on the roof cried, "It's the Americans." That was all it took. As Kramers and his reinforcements rounded the corner, the surviving SS force scattered. It was 3 p.m., and the battle for Castle Itter, one of the last battles to ever be fought in Central Europe, was finally over. In the aftermath, the Wehrmacht troops were arrested and placed in prisoner of war camps. The French VIPs were taken from the castle and spirited away to safer locations. There was actually a photojournalist on hand to document the moment these great men emerged from the castle, shell-shocked, but very much alive. And yet, despite this, the story of the Battle of Castle Itter, it went almost unnoticed. With Germany's unconditional surrender 2 days later, it was simply knocked off the front pages, just another minor skirmish remembered only by those who had been there. It wasn't until 2013 that historian Stephen Harding published his book The Last Battle, and the wider world heard of the unlikely alliance that was forged at Castle Itter that spring day. And by the way, if you've enjoyed this video, we really do suggest reading Harding's book. It's still the only long-form English-language source available on this incredible incident. But the legacy of Castle Itter and the battle there goes far beyond just that of an interesting story. The hostages at Itter were the very cream of French society, men at the pinnacle of their careers. After being rescued, they would go on to shape post-war France. Léon Giraud, for example, would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951. Others would help choose what direction France took in its Fourth and Fifth Republics. Since this was a time when France became a key player in the emerging European Union, this was a big deal. Imagine if Chuchkowicz hadn't been able to cycle fast enough, if Gangel hadn't become so disillusioned with Nazi Germany, if Jack Lee and his tanks hadn't just happened to be hanging around, well, none of these VIPs would have survived the war. That would mean a France, possibly a Europe, that looked very different to the one we know today. After another failed stint at being a hotel, Castle Itter is now in private hands, and it's no longer open to the public. Yet there's no doubting that on one crisp spring day in 1945, the future of the whole of Europe hung in the balance between its walls. It may not be famous, but Castle Itter and the battle that happened there deserves to be remembered by all of us. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. Please do hit that thumbs up button if you did, subscribe, notification bell, all of that great stuff, and also please do check out our sponsor NordVPN, link to them below, and as always, thank you for watching.